Well, good evening. Welcome from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. A special evening presentation of our virtual author series. We're very glad you could join us on this Thursday night in the fall. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the Hall of Fame's Education Department, and very glad to have joining us momentarily highly respected author and historian Lee Lowenfish. Lee has published 5 books on baseball, but we're primarily going to be talking about his newest book, Baseball's Endangered Species, which looks at a very intriguing history of baseball scouting. He has won the prestigious Seymour Medal Award for a book that he did years ago on Branch Rickey. Historian and frequent attendee of our symposium on baseball and American culture. We often will see Lee in the spring when our symposium takes place. Lee often presents at the symposium where a number of leading academics congregate each year. Here are some of Lee's previous books. Did a book with Tom Seaver, The Art of Pitching. As I mentioned, his award-winning book, Branch Rickey, Baseball's Ferocious Gentleman, and also a very intriguing book, The Imperfect Diamond, looking at baseball's history of labor battles over the years. Well, that's enough of an introduction. Let's officially welcome Lee Lowenfish to the virtual author series here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. Lee, how are you?
I'm fine. If I can't be in your beautiful town, Bruce, this is the next best thing because Hall of Fame, your library, your the welcoming spirit there has meant a lot to my research and my writing. So it's a great thrill to be there here tonight.
I believe you live in New York City, right?
Yes, I live about a half mile from Columbia, where I went to undergraduate.
Oh,
I gr-
really?
I grew up south of Central Park on 58th, and my father was a dermatologist who loved baseball. And a couple of his patients were National League umpires, Babe Pinelli, who I got to know, and which our attendees tonight will remember him as the ump in Don Larson's perfect game. And it's the last home plate assignment he ever had. My father also had Bill Stewart as a patient, and I did not get to meet, but he actually won a case of when Leo DeRocher spiked Bill Stewart in late June 1952. It got infected,
Hmm.
and my father won a case, workman's compensation case for Stewart. So baseball is very deep in my blood, and the scouting book kind of emerged because I was starting to go to a lot of high school, college games in the 1980s, and I ran into a baseball scout named Billy Blitzer, and I knew my father had a patient named um, Blitzer, and I said, "Are you related to her?" He said, "Yeah, that's my grandmother." "And are you related to Dr. Lowenfish?" "Yeah, that's my father." And that's how I started to meet baseball scouts. Herb Stein, who became a real inspiration, both of them too. And I have a chapter about how that emerged. Stein signed Rod Carew before the draft, and he signed Frank Viola and Gene Larkin, a Colombian man who got the World Series winning hit in '91 after the draft. So one thing led to another, and this book on scouting got a jump start when I did the Branch Rickey book, because Branch Rickey loved his scouts, and Charlie Barrett being his first and maybe most beloved. And so is a chapter in an earlier part of the new book.
So the interest in scouting, this goes back decades for you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And as Herb Stein used to say, you're nobody until a scout signs you. And that's really true. And there are really so many stories about how you find talent, and many of them certainly in the old days, and I think today would say it takes a good scout to know who not to sign.
Hmm.
Nowadays, with so many people sending videos of talent, I'm a great believer, and it's a theme in this book, that unless you see the talent in competition, eyeball to eyeball, belly button to belly button, as Mel Didier, one of the great scouts I write about, used to say, you're not going to make a good evaluation. And so that's again a theme. And you seeing my book with Tom Seaver, we have the story in this new book about how it was just he was signed by the Braves, but they didn't realize his season had started, and so the Mets picked him out of a hat. And so there's so much chance as well as planning and scouting, and that's what I tried to tell in the new book.
You must have known Tom Seaver very well.
Well, I treasure the experiences I had with him, because it happened. The book, the timing wasn't great, because we got the contract for the book when he came back to the Mets in '83. But at the end of '83, either by mistake or design, no one will ever know really, they did not protect him in the draft that draft that came up in the early years of free agency. So he wound up with the White Sox. So when the book came out, he was already with the White Sox. But I was doing a radio show at the time, so I stayed in touch with Seaver, and I happened to be at the game at Yankee Stadium when he won his 300th game. I think that must have been 1985. It was also Phil Rizzuto Day.
That's
So,
right.
you talk about the connections in baseball. I remember Phil was given a holy cow, a cow, and I think the cow kicked him at the ceremony before the game. And then after the game, Seaver, completes his 9-inning, 300 victory game, and Ozzie Guillen at shortstop catches the ball, in sort of short left center, and so that's just one of the experiences that I had, staying in touch with Seaver. So, boy, is he missed, but boy, what a legacy he left.
I had the pleasure of interviewing him 4 times during a weekend here in Cooperstown. This is probably about 20 years ago, and he was just a delight to work with. He said, you can ask me the same questions each interview. We did them all in the Grandstand Theater here. He said also, you can ask the same questions or you can ask different questions. Whatever you want to ask is fine by me. And we tried to vary him up a little bit, thinking that maybe some people would come back and watch more than one interview. And he was just fantastic.
Well, he used to talk and about, he loved competing so much that he really wondered that second death, how he was going to deal with the first death. When he had to leave the game, he couldn't pitch anymore. In fact, I remember he had a wicked sense of humor, often on others, but often on himself. And he came back. He had left the Red Sox. He was in the dugout when the famous Buckner Mookie Wilson game happened, and then it was also in there for Game 7. Then he was released by the Red Sox. He had a tryout in with the Mets. He came to the Mets the next year, and Barry Lyons hit, I think, 2 homers off him in the simulated game. And so when they asked Seaver about who were the toughest guys he had to face, he said, well, maybe Hank Aaron and Stargell and Barry Lyons. And that's when he retired. And then he found his second life in the wine business. He was tremendously devoted to that. And I met through a college friend, a woman online, who met him in Napa Valley. She also was an amateur wine grower, I believe. And she said he introduced himself as Tom Grower. I mean, he wasn't HOF, so it really, really special human being. And the wine almost came naturally because his father had been in the raisin business in Fresno, California.
Interesting. So your newest book on scouting, the seeds for this planted way back in the 1980s. Why is the book coming out at this time? Did it just take that long to get everything together, or was there something in recent years that triggered this publication now?
Well, that's a good question, and I, I think that there's a great line I heard at a baseball clinic once, where the coach said that uh, Lorne Michaels from SNL was asked about getting that show on the air, and he says, "We go on at 11:30, not because we're ready, but because it's 11:30." Well, I was a year late on getting the manuscript in, and I didn't, you can always do more research, and I decided it was time, and I'm happy put the nose to the grindstone and was able. People who like my Branch Rickey book and have called that the definitive book on Rickey. I never called that definitive because he was such a complicated but basically good man. I will never call this book definitive because for every scout he scouted dozens, hundreds of players. There are that many stories, but I did want to bring to life these people who work behind the shadows, and I felt I wanted to get it out. So, and nowadays it's an important story because analytics is dominating the game right now, but there are signs that people realize that you got to have traditional scouting as well as analytics, and that's the theme of this book. I mean, the change comes slowly in baseball, and and there are stories in here about they didn't want to draft the traditional scouts when it came in 1965, but change happens, and you have to adjust, especially if you want to stay in the business. And so that is a running theme in this book as well. And what it taught me too is I grew up a New York Giant fan and had never rooted for the Yankees, but as a historian, I had to give due to the Yankees, and so an early and big, maybe the biggest chapter in the book is devoted to the Yankees and Paul Krichell, who will be in any scout in the Hall of Fame in the future, because he was the mastermind of that dynasty. I mean, that real dynasty that had the advantages of Jacob Rupert's money, but also knew how to evaluate talent both positively and negatively.
Hmm. Lee, tell us about the cover. Who is this?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's Tom Greenwade. And Tom Greenwade worked with the Dodgers before he worked with the Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. And before that, he worked with the St. Louis Browns. And he was brought into baseball, into the major league organization by Lou Magullo, who later became a big Yankee scout, signing Skowron and Kubek. But he invited Greenwade into the Browns organization in the late 30s. Then he moved to the Dodger organization, and he signed Rex Barney. He recommended the trade for Pee Wee Reese from the Red Sox when he was a minor leaguer. And he also signed probably the pitcher with the greatest name in baseball history, although we have some coming up now. But for bulk of names, he also signed Calvin Coolidge, Julius Caesar, Tuskahoma McGlish. So, and then of course he went to the Yankees, and he stayed on the Yankee payroll, I learned, long after CBS took over, and even in the early years of Steinbrenner. But the fall of the Yankees that I discuss in the book is clearly because they got away from scouting by the early 60s, and that came home to roost in the later 60s into 76.
And of course, Greenwade is the man who brought the Yankees Mickey Mantle.
And Hank Bauer.
Yeah.
He got, and he's a testimony to the importance of getting to know family and makeup. And he told a story about he met Mutt Mantle, Mickey's father, and they saw a game, and Mickey's playing shortstop, and he tells him, well, he's not a shortstop, but we'll give you $1,200, but
Hmm.
we'll have to change position. There are some rumors that he didn't even know he was a switch hitter, because there weren't that many left-handed pitchers in that area of eastern Missouri where he
Hmm.
grew up, eastern Oklahoma where he grew up. But obviously, he came through, and he's what Greenwade's most known for. But one of the things I'm happy about in the book, I've dug into these other stories, like how he was mentored by Maguilo, and signed these others for the Dodgers, and of course Hank Bauer, who was just a remarkable human being, a war hero,
Hmm.
war wounded, and but one of the greatest competitors that the game has ever seen.
Well, let's stick with Yankee scouts as we look at some of the great scouts in history that you profile at various links in the book. You mentioned Paul Krichell a few minutes ago. You devote an entire chapter, and that is certainly understandable, and he's certainly worthy of that. One of really the first great scouts back in the 1920s. Very interesting. I learned, I didn't know this, that he was an immigrant from France.
Yeah, of German descent. He grew up he was born, he came at the age of around 5 to the Lower East Side, but he grew up near where Yankee Stadium was built. He talked about playing in the creek where the stadium would be built. And the other thing, you talk about the importance of connection and loyalty in the game, especially in the older days. I mean, he played and then coached for Ed Barrow,
Mm.
and Ed Barrow was the recipient of Babe Ruth, but yeah, but he also, after Babe Ruth came down to New York, Krichell arrived just a few months later, and then he wound up hiring such great scouts on the West Coast as Joe Devine and Bill Essick, who were both involved in the scouting of Joe DiMaggio. Krichell also gave the okay to Tony Lazzari a few years earlier, and so it's and Devine, before he came to the Yankees, had been with the Pirates, Barney Dreyfus's Pirates, and in 1 year for the Pirates, he signed both Wainer brothers
Mm.
and Pie Traynor. And then the next year, he signed Joe Cronin, although Cronin came to fame and fortune with Boston and later Washington and later Boston. So the Yankees just had these incredibly good scouts. Krichell had Gene McCann helping him on the East, and then Johnny Nee was the one who brought Bill Dickey up uh, from from Georgia. And Johnny Nee said, "If this boy doesn't make the majors, I'll give up scouting." And
Mm.
that's what the great scouts were about. They had the courage of their convictions. Bringing it up back to Herb Stein. Herb Stein said, "I want to know what you feel about the scout, and if you about the player." And if other people tell you the negative things and you still believe in the positive things, well, you stand up for it.
Mm.
And that's what the people who ran the teams and understood baseball were looking for. And I think that still applies. That you makeup, to me, is the sixth tool. I mean, Branch Rickey was probably coined those five tools: the throwing, running, hitting with power, uh, and fielding. But the sixth one is makeup. Does he like to play the game? And believe me, you can't see that on a video or a DVD, no matter how good the editing may be.
Yeah.
And so that's a running theme throughout this book.
I want to get into that issue of makeup and character and personality, especially later in the program as we talk about scouting today. When you talk about Paul Krichell, though, greatest player that he ever signed, I guess, would be Lou Gehrig. Tell us about their meeting for the first time.
Well, Gehrig, Krichell had nothing, looked at the schedule in the early spring of 1923, and he saw that Columbia was playing at Rutgers. And he took the train down to New Brunswick, and this first baseman hits 2 home runs into the Raritan River. After the game, he talks to Andy Coakley, who's the coach of Columbia, and a really remarkable story. Who I'm glad I talked a bit about Coakley in the book. There's so much more needs to be said about Coakley because he pitched for Connie Mack, won 20 games for him one year, and he became the Columbia coach and lasted there until the early 50s. As early as 1934, Coakley wanted the College World Series to be played in New York. Because both Krichell and Coakley were very partial to college players who had some an intelligent approach to the game as well as raw skill. So after Gehrig hits those home runs at Rutgers, he asked Coakley about who is this Gehrig. He said, he's some lefty pitcher who sometimes plays first base and right field. Well, fast forward a couple of days to South Field, which actually is about a half mile from where I live, because it's now in front of Butler Hall on the Columbia campus. And he has another big game against NYU, and by early next week, he's signed to a Yankee contract. And and 2 years later, he comes in for Wally Pipp, and I think the rest of the story is known, to even non-baseball fans.
I'm curious about the rules of the day, and if there were any rules in terms of a scout having contact with an amateur player in college. Did Krichell have to get permission from Coakley to talk to Gehrig?
That's a very good question, and I talk about it a bit in the book. In 1921, Gehrig played in Hartford, Connecticut under an assumed name. And that was that procedure so they wouldn't lose eligibility. When Coakley finds out what's happening, he goes up to Hartford, brings him back. The Ivy League poobahs get together, and they decide that all right, he'll be ineligible for the next year, but he can come back for the 1923 baseball season. And the thing is, this is important in the days of NIL now, and where players, basically the boosters are now running wild. But this stuff went on. It was unfair to the athlete, but it was accepted. Charles Chapman, who's in the prior Chapman, became a great scout for Branch Rickey and then later for the Reds. He played under an assumed name because for the same reason.
Yeah.
And Rickey also lost his eligibility at Ohio Wesleyan because he had played semi-pro ball so he could afford his tuition. So they knew as early as the 1905, 1910 that this wasn't right, but it was also that's the way it was.
Yeah.
The NCAA didn't start until 1905, and then the more and more the regulations came in, but still there were always ways of getting around it. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised it because it's an important story, and it affected so many people at that time.
This, of course, could not happen in today's age where everything is covered by social media. There are cameras everywhere. But back in the 1920s, nobody's filming games. So, you could do these covert operations. And I'm sure a lot of times the players like Gehrig weren't even aware that they were actually breaking rules. I'm sure they were manipulated by other supposed adults that were supposed to be in the room. But it's all part of this interesting story. You talk about makeup of players. And when Krichell met Gehrig, it must have been pretty obvious to him right from the start that this was a guy of incredible character.
Well, certainly he was he was very shy. That was clear. It was early on. But when Barrow sat there down there on Fifth Avenue south of Central Park and saw the tree trunk legs on Gehrig, I mean, he said those words, "Don't let that are immortal." I mean, Branch Rickey supposedly said that about Johnny Padres, even though he had a sense he was leaving Brooklyn, sign that guy. Similarly, sign that guy. And of course, Gehrig came from a family of not much wealth, to say the least. And so he was an easy sign. And the thing that Krichell did, because the shyness was really there, he got off to a slow start at Hartford, where he had played 2 years before, and Coakley dragged him back, and he wanted to see how he was doing. And that kind of paternal thing in the early years of scouting is very is a running part of the story that I wanted to tell, because the great scouts always cared about how the player did later on. I say early in the book that if you have organizations where the scouts and the player developers are at loggerheads, no way you're going to win, because the scouts will be shouting at the player developers, "What did you do to my player?" And the player developer would say, "Well, what did you see in this guy in the first place?" So Krichell went to see Gehrig and sort of made sure that he wasn't too homesick. Branch Rickey, you carried it maybe to excess, flying to minor league teams in case a player was homesick. But that's so important, because the essence of this game is a game about failure, and every time you move up against better competition. How are you going to react to that failure? I mean, that is the running story of baseball, which makes it so compelling and so important to look at what makes the coconut tick. And the great thing about baseball, it's still not played with too much paraphernalia. I mean, the arms and stuff maybe, but you can see how somebody is reacting, and it's better to see it in person. But even the TV camera can look into the heart of a guy, or the mind, and see what's happening. And the scout is the one who knows that, because he sees him from the earliest time. He gets to sense the family. I mean, as late as the 1950s, there's a story in the book about how Lou Magulo signed Norm Seaburn, because he was a great basketball player, and he thought about that. And his father, loved baseball, but he didn't want to, wanted his son to get a good deal. And so Mrs. Seaburn comes out of the kitchen and says, "I'm so sorry. I had cookies for you, but the oven's on the blink." So Magulo says, "How about putting in a new oven in the contract?" And that's how it was. The deal was sealed. So it's and Seaburn's father, by the way, I think became a member of Sabre, and also a scorer on the local level in Missouri. So you want to see about the love of the game, that in it, and the good scouts are always looking to that, because you just how are they going to react? How is the player going to react when things go bad?
Lee, another important early scout was also an immigrant. That's Joe Cambria. Now, he was born in Italy, in a town or a city called Messina, but he ends up developing this pipeline of talent from Cuba to the US. How did that come about?
Well, he went into the laundry business in Baltimore, and he had a that business. He also got involved in a lot of black baseball teams,
Hmm.
and he didn't know Spanish, but he made a network that was very big in Latin America and Cuba, and including Cuba, and he became tight with Clark Griffiths, and he was Griffiths' um, number one scout. He was the mentor of Herb Stein, who who I mentioned in the book. Said he was he traveled. His suitcase was his suit. I mean, he had one suit for travel and one suit that he wore, and he changed them, and he was always on the road.
Hmm.
And and he was instrumental in bringing those Cuban players, Pascual, Camilo Pascual, Pedro Ramos, Julio Bequer, who I'll never forget. About over almost 10 years ago, they had a Cuban at the Fordham Law School here in New York, and it was a seminar and on Cuban baseball, and it was mainly in Spanish. And people were told at the beginning that don't go for autographs. I mean, this is a serious event. And of course, the moment Manny Minoso walked in the room and Julio Bequer, everyone went wild. Maybe the academics the most. But I'll never forget Bequer, who was a real gentleman, just passed away within the last year or so. He told me that Calvin Griffiths, the adopted son who took over when Clark died in the mid-50s, saw to it that after the Bay of Pigs, that the family, his wife and his extended family were brought up to Minneapolis thanks to the intervention of Calvin Griffiths.
Hmm.
And of course Tony Oliva was another one from a later generation. So Cambria is really an important figure, but it also shows why baseball is so chaotic and maybe never will be less chaotic.
Hmm.
Because every organization had their own way of doing things, and and there was not any leadership, certainly not now, that talked about the overall good of the game. So, but I still maintain that if you don't have a good scouting department and that's on the same page more or less with player development, you're not going to win.
Here's what I don't get about Cambria. He's a guy from Italy and he doesn't speak Spanish. How is he able to communicate with these Latino ball players in Cuba?
Well, it's funny, it's been said about Howie Hake, who was Branch Rickey's number one scout in Latin America, that Hake only knew 4 words of Spanish: run fast, hit hard, throw hard. Run fast, throw hard will teach you the lesson. There is something about baseball, Bruce, that especially in this very murderous world right now, that is so special. I mean, if you see the glint in the eye of somebody on a field, and you see some tools, and you see him in competition, and they see that you care about them, a lot of language may not be necessary.
Wow, that's fascinating. Our guest is Lee Lowenfish, author of the terrific new book, Baseball's Endangered Species, Inside the Craft of Scouting by Those Who Lived It. We want to talk about some of these other very important people that are part of this complicated fabric of scouting. Here is another name that comes to mind, Al Campanis. And probably if you mention the name Campanis to a fan my age, I'm in my 50s or younger, the first thing that comes to mind is his disastrous performance on the Nightline program with Ted Koppel back in the late 1980s. And not to say that that shouldn't be covered and that that shouldn't be told, that is part of his story. But years before, Al Campanis established himself as one of the great scouting minds in baseball with the Brooklyn and LA Dodgers.
Not only that, Bruce, and I'm glad we're talking about him, he played at Montreal with Jackie Robinson in 1946. And Jackie Robinson basically took his position at second base, but he taught Robinson the finer nuances of playing second base. Just like in spring training in 1947, George Sisler, the Hall of Famer and the longtime Rickey man, taught Jackie the some of the niceties of first base. So he was a great teacher. And Mel Didier, who I talk about in the book, learned so much from Campanis, so much that he wanted to be with the Dodgers at some point in his scouting career, and he was. And the thing with Campanis is that he was a teacher, and with Fresco Thompson on the right, they wrote books about the Dodger way of playing ball. And it's again about the importance of defense, the importance of throwing, anticipation, and he's a person who was part of his age in terms of unfortunate views of the opposite race in this country, but his contribution should not be ignored. And of course, one of the great ironies about that show with Ted Koppel is that he was a late-minute substitute for Don Newcombe, and when he tried to talk back to Ted Koppel about how many blacks are in the ranks of ABC, which is a rather good question, he got shut down because he wasn't a adept at speaking. So I mean, I'm glad we've talked about Campanis because his contributions to scouting were really genuine, and the Dodger way that was poured in by Rickey. And though O'Malley and Rickey had the feud that was deep and financial and egotistical, it was to O'Malley's credit that he did keep the essence of that system, into Los Angeles, and they've always had a very good way of teaching the game.
Now, Campanis was a disciple of Branch Rickey, and everything I've read about Campanis when he worked as a scout, when he worked in the Dodgers front office, he was very open to signing Black players, Latino players. He didn't. There weren't really these indications of racism. And as you mentioned, Jackie Robinson apparently got along with him very well, and Campanis did something that many players of that era would not do. Veteran players sort of cleared the way. A lot of veteran players would make life difficult for the rookies trying to replace them. So we see a lot of enigmatic things going on with Campanis.
Well, or the complications of human existence in the most difficult sport I know to master, but we're living in a society where scapegoating is a lot easier than trying to understand and not exonerate somebody, but you don't banish somebody for something he said under a very unusual circumstance. And one of the great ironies is that Harry Edwards came in, and the first person he spoke to or hired, actually, maybe the only person he hired, was Al Campanis, and which in a way was a Branch Rickey type thing of doing, because Rickey had that motto in his office about he who will not reason is a he who cannot reason is anyway, the difference between bigotry and racism, and that he felt, and I agree, that a racist can be educated. And that's what Edwards tried to do with Campanis, but he didn't stay in baseball long enough. And he's the one who led the Olympic boycott a few years earlier. A bigot is someone who cannot reason and doesn't want to reason.
I'm
So
trying to remember, Lee, was Harry Edwards brought in by Major League Baseball after this to try to
I think
prove?
I think Uberoth brought him in.
Okay.
And I remember Frank Robinson was on TV right after the this incident, and he listed a whole bunch of names of people who could go into baseball, like his former teammate Don Buford and Al Jackson, who became one of the great pitching coaches. But Frank Robinson and Harry Edwards couldn't work together. I don't know the exact details, but Edwards did not stay baseball for long, in part because of what I said before. Baseball then was, I guess, about 24 teams operating separately. And so, I mean, how do you develop a policy, a just policy with 24 teams going often in different directions?
Yeah. I imagine, Lee, you've seen this photo numerous times. It's part of our collection here at the Hall of Fame, and I'll read you the caption. It says, Koufax, left-handed bonus rookie pitcher attending the University of Cincinnati, is home for the holidays and tried on the uniform he will wear March 1st at Vero Beach Training Camp, 1954. Caption written in a very 1950s style. So you have Campanis on the left, Koufax in the middle. Fresco Thompson is a name that maybe people outside of the baseball inside world don't know much about, but he was another important talent evaluator in that Dodger system.
Absolutely, and another former infielder, and who wrote a couple of books about player development. And and when Rickey was banished to Pittsburgh, he they didn't hire a replacement for him. They made Campanis and Thompson their co-general managers, and may not have even given him that name. And they really they practiced the Rickey way. And I'm so glad, by the way, that the Carl Erskine documentary is getting some play, because I mean, Carl Erskine at 97, I guess, is the last key boy of summer remaining. And I mean, he was a Rickey person, and I mean, he knew. Again, I mean, one of the reasons the Rickey book took a long time was that he took advantage of the reserve system. And I mean, Erskine was one of those. But in terms of understanding the game and what it meant spiritually, I mean, Erskine told me about when he threw the baseball, he thought of the stitches, and he thought of what Branch Rickey told him about religion was something that goes through your life like these stitches in a baseball. You need them all. And it really that's the kind that goes again back to makeup. And the and another way of expressing this is a slogan that I saw in the Tampa Rays clubhouse many years ago. Champions are made when no one is watching. And so, and in this time when there's so much on statistics, and this guy has got 40 stolen bases, 70 stolen bases, 40 homers. Isn't that wonderful? Well, are you more interested in the statistics, or are you more interested in winning? And it's I think the game is so great because of the challenges it faces. But I just don't ever want us to be sacrificed at the altar of too many statistics that don't get to the heart of makeup.
One of the most interesting people, I think, in the scouting world is this guy. And I learned a lot about Jim Russo. I was doing research for a book on the 1971 World Series between the Pirates and the Orioles. And that Orioles team, in many ways, was put together by Russo. still an underrated scout. Started his career in St. Louis with the Browns, and then he moves to Baltimore when the franchise moves there. And with the Orioles, that's where he really hits his stride. Signed many great players, but among them, well, Jim Palmer, Hall of Famer, and Dave McNally, two kingpins of that starting rotation.
I know that. I mean, Russo. You talk about the family connections. His brother was Neil Russo, one of the prime St. Louis newspaper men. Russo started in radio in the 1940s on a station where Paul Harvey was on.
Wow.
And then he came, and I have some of the stories of Russo in the last chapter, because he was with the Browns when Bill Enos, the great Red Sox scout who started with the Browns, was there. And Russo was the one too who saw the Yankee decline beginning in the early 60s, when they didn't go to signing Jim Palmer and Dave McNally. They did not get into the bidding for those two. And so he stayed on, and and the thing about him, and this was true of the great scouts and really the great leaders in any field. They were not yes men. They wanted conflict. They in fact, Rickey loved conflict, to great degrees. But it was respectful conflict. They wanted an opinion, then you give an opinion, and then you ultimately settle. And so, being an Oriole fan, I was glad to tell some of Russo's stories and how the Orioles did build that near dynasty. It wasn't really a dynasty because they only won 2 World Series, but or under Weaver anyway. But the it's a story of how you cope with these imponderables, and so no scout or no team can move forward without the input from scouts. And so again, you really have a good one up on your screen now, Bruce.
Well, we talk about Palmer and McNally, who were signed as amateurs. Did Russo have any input on major league talent? For example, the Frank Robinson trade. Was he involved in that in any way?
Yeah, Frank Cashin told me that Russo was his man on the in the American League scouting. I think it was more Bill Worrell on the National League. Bill Worrell, a former Pirate pitcher, Werle. But again, it was a combination of people fighting it out as to who would ultimately get their person. And of course, the key, and before we end, I do want to mention something about the Braves, because I mean, Paul Snyder played for the Brave organization in the early 60s, and he's so much a part of how the Braves developed from Ted Turner into what they became as a constant contender. And so I hope they extend tonight the series. But in any event, the Braves with Roland Heeman, the nearly sainted Roland Heeman getting his start there as well, are another organization that really were good to the scouts, and saw that the relationship with the scouts and player did not was not ignored. And again, I want to mention another chapter in the book, Red Murph, Murff, because thanks to your library, Bruce, I found his book, The Scout, many years ago. And he had a great description of scouting as being a underground brotherhood without the secret handshakes. And he, of course, wound up signing Nolan Ryan, and saw him in high school when his high school coach didn't even think he was the best pitcher on his team. He was only 140 pounds at the time,
Hmm.
but he saw that he would grow, and then he also recommended Koosman, who he saw at a Fort Bliss in the Army in the early 60s. He also recommended both Boswell and Grody to the Mets.
Hmm.
So it's a story that I wanted to tell, and that I've hope inspires other work. And as I think out loud here, what you have now is with so many players coming from college and coaches going back and forth, you now have a uh, a lot of college coaches coming into the game, and we'll see how that works out over time, because they cut the draft to 20 rounds, and I know the veteran scouts really don't like that, because they really feel there's a lot of talent out there that can't be chosen in 20 rounds.
Hmm.
And great scouting directors would get up, and general managers like Tony Damasio, who I talk about in the book, would talk about it. You'd go to a meeting, and Shorholtz would get up and say, there are future Hall of Famers out there. Find them. You can find them, And so I think that's a note as we near the end that I want to stress. And that's why I ended the book with the story of the late Kelly Rodman, who grew up a Met fan, I heard, and was a very good softball player who went out and played hardball overseas. And then she became a growing, highly respected scout for the Yankees. In
Hmm.
fact, she was the biggest advocate, or one of them, for Anthony Volpe.
Wow.
So yeah, there are scouts out there and there are players out there, and it is such a great, if demanding, game. And so I hope my work has tried to explain that, and hopefully encourage people to give it a shot.
I want to go back, Lee, to the Orioles of the 60s and 70s. We, of course, recently lost our beloved Hall of Famer, Brooks Robinson, passed away just a few weeks ago, one of our real favorites here in Cooperstown. He was signed by the Orioles after his high school graduation in 1955. Tell us the story that surrounds that, and about how his signing angered another team, the Cincinnati Reds.
Well, I'm glad we're coming back to how barbaric and anti-legal the whole situation was in baseball and all sports at this time. His father was a good semi-pro player, a fire department captain, and he goes to the meeting, and the Orioles, again, the area scout Lindsey Deal, working with Paul Richards, the big man in Baltimore at the time, says this is a man who is going to. I think he's going to be a major leaguer. I mean, he's not a second baseman. He doesn't run very well, but he's not a plow horse. And so the Orioles, he signs for 4,000. The Indians, then the Indians cry foul. Excuse me. I'm sorry. The Cincinnati Reds, and Paul Florence files a protest with Commissioner Ford Frick. And Brooks, they fly him to New York. As Brooks remembered, he puts his hand on the Bible and says, I did not take any money under the table, and my $4,000 is the amount that is low enough so I won't have to sit on the bench for 2 years, as 3 future Hall of Famers had to do: Kuhn, Killebrew, and Koufax. It didn't hurt Keene and Kaline that much. It sure hurt Koufax and a lot of others. And that's how Brooks came to Baltimore. And he was playing second base in the minors, and I believe in York, Pennsylvania, and he almost got badly cut on a fence, going for a foul ball. And at that time, a lot of scouts, including Bill Enos, who was now at that time with the Orioles, said this is a third baseman. And I mean, Brooks will live in our hearts forever, because he really was such a special person. Also, because when the Players Association started growing, he became a bulwark, a moderate bulwark But when push came to shove, and the owners were trying to do what they had done under their old rules, I mean, he stood up for what was right.
Brooks, toward the tail end of his career, saw free agency come into baseball. And of course, the Andy Messersmith, Dave McNally decisions lead to a new collective bargaining agreement between the players and the owners. We see that first free agent class that emerges the winter of 1976. I know this somewhat of a complicated topic, but I'm going to ask you to give a relatively short answer, if you would. When you look at free agency and how it affected scouting, obviously scouting at the major league level, is there a big impact there? Is there a big correlation there?
Well, the big impact happened 10 years earlier, when the amateur free agent draft came in, because but the older scouts loved the romancing of the family, especially the mother. They loved hiding players. Herb Stein told me about Carew. I mean, he would tell other teams Carew's playing in Rockland County, when he wasn't. And then, but once the draft came in, you only have one chance at a player. Now, when free agency came in, the good teams used and the Orioles in the early years of free agent were smart. They picked up a Steve Stone, but but they didn't go crazy the way Steinbrenner did. Of course, it worked for Steinbrenner in the early years. In terms of scouting, the scouts kept going on. I mean, it was a fairly fair agreement. In fact, the site's ruling actually could have made everyone a free agent after the 1976 season. But the players, Miller and Robinson and the moderates said, well, let's do 6 years. And people forget that there was a draft of those who were free agents after 76.
That's
and
right.
there were only about 40 players who actually became free agents. In fact, one of the greatest ironies of that Messersmith in particular, Messersmith went to be free agent because he wanted a 2 or 3 year contract. Dodgers wouldn't give it to him. McNally had already retired. Montreal made a horrible deal. They got McNally and Coggins, who lost interest in baseball, and all the Orioles got was Singleton and Mike Torres, who later turned into Reggie Jackson and Holtzman briefly. So, but McNally was a hard-nosed guy. He had been and Brooks too. I mean, Brooks was a sweet man, but he had been lowballed or in the old days of the reserve system. So McNally just said, well, if this screws the owners, it's fine. So the union actually compromised, but then it became the pissing match between Miller and Kuhn, and then Ray Grebe with and then the big strike in 81, and somewhere in the 80s, the union was able to get free agent contracts applied to salary arbitration. And that is still in effect, and that's what's killing things now. That's why a smaller market team with not an owner who wants to spend is going to lose a lot of players, because if Mr. Cole gets 43 million, well, some player who's only half as good, well, I'll get 20. I'll settle for 20. I mean, and that's where I'm pessimistic about whether there's ever going to be any change. But in a positive sense, when you look at the Diamondbacks, you look at the Orioles, doing it cheaply with people who love to play and also play good defense, which a lot of the analytical people poo-poo. I mean, maybe there can be some way in the future, but and whatever in terms of scouting, there are always going to be scouts, just like there are always going to be players. And that's where, while in my head, I often get pessimistic about the future of a lot of things. My heart, with the color changing, and as Dave Parker said, when the leaves turn to brown, I'll be wearing the batting crown. When you have that kind of essence in the game, I think somehow it'll survive.
Well, there's no question that scouts have become, in many ways, more important over the last 50 years. Free agency, of course, another avenue to acquire talent, whereas before it was strictly trades and, of course, the amateur draft. Just a couple of quick hitters, Lee, before we let you go. 2016, MLB eliminated its centralized scouting bureau. This was something that happened pretty quietly. Was this good, bad, or indifferent for the game?
I don't think it was good. And if it was done just for cost cutting reasons, it was really not good. I mean, when you consider the need to evaluate, I mean, evaluation can only be done by people in the field, and the more, I mean, you can't fully evaluate a player at a perfect game showcase. Now, it's interesting. Just the other day, Dennis Gilbert was named the commissioner of the perfect game, and Dennis Gilbert did wonderful things with his Professional Baseball Scouts Foundation. And he started as an agent. And in fact, I never forget being on a plane going to a winter meeting, and he was on a plane with Barry Bonds talking out loud about what a low ball offer he had gotten in free agency. But early in the century, he became a real believer in scouting, and I hope he can bring some of that into that perfect game showcase arena. But I think the more information you have about a player, the better it is.
Of course, the title of the book is Baseball's Endangered Species, and we understand that title when we see things like 2017. The Houston Astros, on their way to winning a World Series, fire 10 of their professional scouts. This continuing a trend that we've seen in recent years. But as you mentioned earlier in the show, we may be starting to come back toward the importance of scouts again. I think teams are starting to realize that statistical analysis, while it's very good, has its limits. You need that human touch. You need that human reaction. Final question, Lee. Are talent evaluators today, are they still looking at character, makeup, personality, or is all that given way to statistical analysis?
Well, the good ones can't just rely on statistical analysis. I love this quote from Branch Rickey in Kevin Corain's masterful 40-year-old book, Dollar Sign on the Muscle, which comes from a Rickey statement about, at crunch time, you have to put a dollar sign on the muscle of this athlete. He was asked by a scout, how much of baseball do you really know, Mr. Rickey? And he said, I don't think I know more than 55%. Well, I mean, I don't. I go to a fraction of that, but boy, you must combine intuition and your own experience with all the newfangled things, because you can't have one without the other.
So you think it is somewhat being ignored?
Well, I think it's changing for the better. I mean, I think the Astros started to hire more scouts. The Orioles, I was a skeptic about what Elias is doing, but certainly I'm more of a believer now. And the good teams are hiring and treating their scouts and player developers better. The bad teams aren't, and in the history of baseball, there have been far more bad teams than good teams. But one thing I did learn when I started working on Branch Rickey in the 1990s is that, and also working with Tony Lupian on the first edition of A Perfect Diamond, is that the teams that didn't win that often also had great scouts. I mean, Connie Mack, Griffiths, and the Red Sox. They didn't have the they scouted maybe too heavily to the games in Fenway Park. They didn't have the athletes that could play on the road. But so it's a big umbrella, baseball and scouting, and I would hate to see people think that Moneyball or Better Ball, as I mentioned in the introduction, creation of Dipoto of Seattle, would hate to think they would dominate, and I have guarded hopes that it won't happen, and there'll be certainly room for those who have an intuition and experience, as well as all the latest in the statistics.
The book is Baseball's Endangered Species: Inside the Craft of Scouting by Those Who Lived It. It is available from the University of Nebraska Press. You can go to Amazon.com. And do you have a website too, Lee, where people can purchase the book?
Yes, it's LeeLowenfish.com. And I blog every couple of weeks or more. With the Orioles in the hunt, I was blogging a little more. And I hope we have some memorable end of season. And at another time, Bruce, I would like to talk about something that nobody's talking about. We have to shorten the regular season. 154 games at the very least. What about 144, which was the strike season of 95? Because that way you're not going to be playing into Halloween and beyond. You'll have more rested players, and I guess because of all this talk about 100 win teams, don't go on. Well, if you have fewer games, you'll have fewer 100 get teams. But remember the poor Indians in 1954. They won 111 and got wiped out by the Giants in 4. So it's not like this hasn't happened before, people.
Yeah. Oh yeah, everything repeats in baseball. Lee, we really appreciate your time. It's a wonderful book, great insights on the history of scouting. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Lee Lowenfish, frequent visitor to Cooperstown, terrific author, award-winning author, and his book is excellent, Baseball's Endangered Species. We thank Lee. We thank our listeners as well for joining us on this Thursday evening. Have a great day or a great night, everybody. Take care.